Life of David Livingston, Part 10. Sebetene was about 45 years of age, of a tall, wiry form, an olive or copper or coffee and milk color, slightly bald, in manner cool and collected, and more frank in his answers than any chief I ever met. He was the greatest warrior ever heard of beyond the colony, for unlike Maseletsky, Dinigan, and others, he had led his men into battle himself. When he saw the enemy, he felt the edge of his battle axe and said, "Ah, it is sharp, and whoever turns his back on the enemy will feel its edge." So fleet of foot was he. All his people knew there was no escape for the cowards, as any such would be cut down without any mercy. In some instances of skulking, he allowed the individual to return home. Then, calling him, he would say, "Ah, you prefer dying at home to dying in the field, do you? You shall have your desire." This was the signal for his immediate execution. He came from the country near the sources of the Litwa and Namagari rivers in the south, so we met him 800 or 900 miles from his birthplace. He was not the son of a chief, though related closely to the reigning family of the Batsu, and when, in the attack by Sikoloyele, the tribe was driven out of one part, Sebenetoene was one of the immense horde of savages driven back by the Grinquas from Kuruman in 1824. He then fled northward from an insignificant party of men and cattle. At Meleta, the Bangawaskanetese collected the Bakawanes, Bakatala, and Buhuratus to eat them up. Placing his men in front and the women behind the cattle, he routed the whole of his enemies at one blow, having thus conquered Makembe, the chief of the Bangatuarse. He took immediate possession of his town and all his goods. Sebentine subsequently settled at a place called Litubataraba, where Sechelele now dwells, and his people suffered severely in one of those unrecorded attacks by white men, in which murder was committed and materials laid up in the conscience for a future judgment. A great variety of fortune followed him in the northern part of the Bechuana country. Twice he lost all his cattle by the attacks of the Metabele, but always kept his people together and retook more than he lost. He then crossed the desert by nearly the same path that we did. He had captured a guide, and as it was necessary to travel by night in order to reach the water, the guide took advantage of this and gave him the slip. After marching till morning and going as they thought right, they found themselves on the trail of the day before. Many of his cattle burst away from him in the frenzy of thirst and rushed back to Serotli, then a large piece of water, and to Meshu and Lepepe, the inhabitants of their original owners. He stalked himself again among the Betaleti on Lake Kamandu, whose herds were all of the long-horned species of cattle. Conquering all around the lake, he heard of white men living at the west coast. Haunted by what seems to have been the dream of his whole life, a desire to have intercourse with the white man, he passed away to the southwest into parts opened up lately by Messrs. Galton and Anderson. There, suffering intensely from thirst, he and his party came to a small well. He decided that the men, not the cattle, should drink it, the former being the most value, and they could fight for more should these be lost. In the morning, they found the cattle had escaped to the Damaras. Returning to the north poorer than they started, he ascended the Teglahe to the hill Sorelia and crossed over a swampy country to the eastward, pursuing his course onward to the low-lying basin of the Liambai. He saw that it presented no attractions to a pastoral tribe like his, so he moved down that river along the Bashubia and Batoka, who were then living in all their glory. His narrative resembles closely the commentaries of Caesar and the history of the British in India. He is always forced to attack the different tribes, and to this day his men justify every step he took as perfectly just and right. The Batoka lived on large islands in the Liambai and Zambezi, and feeling perfectly secure in their fastness, often allured fugitive and wandering tribes onto uninhabited islands on pretense of ferrying them across, and then left them to perish for the sake of their goods. Sakomani, the chief of the Bamangawatsi, was when a child in danger of meeting his fate, but a man still living had compassion on him, and enabled his mother to escape with him by night. The river was so large that the sharpest eye cannot tell the difference between an island and a bend in the opposite bank. But Sebenente, with his unusual foresight, requested the island chief, who ferried him across, to take his seat in a canoe with him and detain him by his side. All his people and cattle were safely landed. The whole Batoka country was then densely populated, and they had a curious taste for ornamenting their villages with the skulls of strangers. When Sebente appeared near the great falls, an immense army collected to mark trophies of the Makololo skulls, but instead of succeeding in this, they gave him a good excuse for conquering them and capturing so many cattle that his people were quite incapable of taking any note of the sheep and goats. He overran all the highlands towards the Kofu and settled in what is called a pastoral country of gentle, undulating plains covered with short grass and but little forests. The Makololo have never lost their love of this fine, healthy region, but the Matembele and Kafera and Zulu tribe under Masetilakaste crossed the Zambezi, and attacking Sebente in this choice spot, captured his cattle and women. Rallying his men, he followed and recaptured the whole. A fresh attack was also repulsed, and Sebente thought of going further down the Zambezi to the country of the white men. He had an idea, whence imbibed I never could learn, that if he had a cannon, he might live in peace. He had led a life of war. No one apparently desired peace more than he did. Sebente had now not only conquered all the black tribes over the immense tract of country, but had made himself dreaded even by the terrible Masilita Keste. He never could trust his ferocious chief, however, and sorry. As the Batoka and the islands had been guilty of ferrying his enemies across the Zambezi, he made a rapid descent upon them and swept them all out of the island out of their island fastnesses. He thus unwittingly performed a good service to the country by completely breaking down the old system which prevented trade and penetrating into the great central valley. Of the chiefs who escaped, he said, "They loved Master let them live with him. The Zambezi is my line of defense," and men were placed all along as sentinels. When he heard of our wish to visit him, he did all that he could to assist our approach. Sechel, Sakomi, and Leshutelotebe owed their lives to his clemency, and the latter might have paid dearly for his obstructiveness. Sebente knew everything had to everything had happened in the country, for he everything that had happened in the country, for he had the great art of gaining the affections both of his own people and of that of strangers. When a party of poor men came to his town to sell their hose or skins, no matter how ungainly they might be, he soon knew them all. A company of these men, indignant strangers, sitting far apart from the Makololo gentlemen around the chief, would be surprised to see him come alone to them, and sitting down, inquire if they were hungry. He would order the attendant to bring a meal, milk, honey, mixture, and mixing them in their sight, in order to remove any suspicion in their minds, make them feast perhaps for the first time in their lives on a lordly dish. Delighted beyond measure with his affability and liberality, they felt their hearts warm towards him and gave him all their information in their power. And as he never allowed the party of strangers to go away without giving every one of them, servants and all, a present, his praises were sounded far and wide. He had a heart, he is wise. He has a heart, he is wise, were the usual expressions we heard before we saw him. He was much pleased with the proof of confidence he had shown in bringing our children, and promised to take us into his country, so that we might choose a part in which to locate ourselves. Our plan was that I should remain in the pursuit of my objects as a missionary, while Mr. Oswell explored the Zambezi to the east. Poor Sebente, however, just after realizing what he had so long ardently desired, fell sick of inflammation of the lungs, which originated extended from an old wound got at Malicia. I saw his danger, but being a stranger, I feared to treat him medically, lest in the event of his death I should be blamed by his people. I mentioned this to one of his doctors, who said, "Your fear is prudent and wise. This people will blame you." He had been cured of this complaint during the year before, but by the Batos marking a large number of free incisions in the chest. The Makololo doctors, on the other hand, now scarcely cut the skin. On the Sunday afternoon in which he died, when our usual religious service was over, I visited him with my little boy Robert. "Come near," said Sebentine, "and see if I am any longer a man. I am done." He was thus sensible of the dangerous nature of his disease, so I ventured to assent, and added a single sentence regarding hope after death. "Why do you speak of death?" said one of a relay of fresh doctors. "Sebente will never die." If I had persisted, the impression would have been produced that by speaking about it I wished him to die. If I had persisted, the impression would have been produced that by speaking about it I wished him to die. After sitting with him some time and commending him to the mercy of God, I rose to depart, when the dying chieftain, raising himself up a little from his prone position, called a servant and said, "Take Robert to Manuku," one of his wives, "and tell her to give him some milk." These were the last words of Sebente.